Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session with the acceptable Ian Dunt, who is well known to you all as one of Britain's leading political commentators.
Oh, wow, fantastic.
An incisive mind that has helped lay bare for us over the last few years in particular. I know you've got many fans here. Some of the most significant developments in British politics and world politics that we've all experienced. He is someone whose views are always very sound, but even more so when he changes them over time, which is something that, which is unpopular these days, to change your mind when the evidence changes, but Ian does it. And
what the fuck are you talking about? Oh, well, we'll come on to that later.
Maybe he's never changed. You'll have heard him on his podcast. You'll have read him in the I. That's right? The I,
yes.
Yeah. He's the new chair of the editorial board of New Humanist magazine, which is now part of Humanists UK, as you know, and we're very lucky. And the author of 3 excellent books. Don't tell me
whose titles you can't remember.
Yes, I can actually. How to Be a Liberal.
Excellent.
Brexit, what a fucking mess.
It's basically.
And How Westminster Is. How Westminster Works and Why It Doesn't, which is also the title of our session today. Is that you?
It's not me.
Who's saying 1, 2?
I don't know, maybe it's God.
This is a very inconvenient time for a manifestation. That's the case. Although no refunds, let me just get that out there right away. So, Ian, it's wonderful that you're joining us here today. And we are going to talk a little bit about the Westminster system, how it's working now. We've had a big change, or have we? That's part of the question, over the last 12 months. Actually, you've been one of the commentators who I've seen being the biggest advocate for the fact that there has been a significant change with the new government. Are things better now than they were just over a year ago?
Yes, but that's not saying much. Most of the stuff, the work that I do in politics is not really the day-to-day stuff. It's about sort of what are the institutions, what are the structures, what are the incentives, and those stay the same. You know, you can change them, but they don't change just because you've had an election. So that stays the same, and there's a bunch of pernicious behaviour that we're already seeing that we saw before. However, personalities do count, like they do matter, and having people that are fundamentally decent-minded and that are socially conscientious and that are able to embrace detail rather than flee from it, having people who just fundamentally on like an electoral level want to build, for self-interested reasons, a broad electoral coalition rather than stoke one part of the electorate and pitch it against the other, all of those are healthy developments.
You think they're developments that we've seen?
Yeah, I think we absolutely have. I mean, if to take Brexit really broke something in us. Suddenly there was a real electoral advantage to saying, you know what, we've got a group here that on cultural issues, we can just own and dominate that group. And you'll remember afterwards, so it starts as tragedy and then proceeds as comedy. Because once Brexit's done, there was just this period where Boris Johnson and the prime ministers that followed him were just desperately trying to find another Brexit. Do you remember for ages they would talk about statues, then you talk about pronouns, you're just looking for something else that can make that electoral calculus work. Now, we can have all sorts of problems with the Labour government and with the Prime Minister himself at the moment, and I think there are really legitimate reasons to be concerned about some of the things that are happening. But that is not the emotional instinct. It's clearly not the electoral strategy. That is a really distinct place that you find yourself, and that makes it a healthier place than we were in a year ago. But like I say, that is a low bar. We need to be aiming for better bars than that.
Yeah, that bar is very low, isn't it? I mean, it's lower now than at any time in your life or mine. I don't know whether it's lower than any time in other people's lives too, whose lives are a bit longer. But I think it definitely is. How do we raise the bar?
Well, you can demand more from your politicians, and you can agitate for a better level of performance than what we've seen right now, and we can decide that we're going to discuss things in a way that is not about tribalism and venom and mutual incomprehension. I mean, all of these things are available to us, but we have to actually do something about them ourselves. And part of that is also about asking the kind of reforms that we want to see in society. So no, I mean, it's all possible for us to achieve. We just need to, do it.
The Westminster system has many flaws. And one of them, you were in this session with Lizzie earlier, I know, listening to the talk about assisted dying. One of the things that really has stuck out for me in the assisted dying developments that we've had in the UK is the contrast between the Scottish Parliament system, which has this wonderful system of pre-legislative scrutiny and expert advice before private members' bills, and then stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, even the stages make more sense than second reading, third reading. And the Westminster system, which although Lizzie defended it as being a good example of Parliament doing as well as it could in the circumstances, has been, in contrast with Scotland, just a mess, Lots of really nasty views, lots of false claims, a lack of shared evidence because there's no pre-legislative scrutiny and so on and so forth. That, for me, has illustrated one of the reforms that I would like to see of the Westminster Parliament, which, of course, Brown government proposed. Do you remember they proposed a pre-legislative stage in Parliament where you were taking expert witnesses and so on? What would be your top 3 reforms of the Westminster Parliament?
Jesus Christ. I mean, to limit myself to 3 is actually quite hard.
What would be your top 130 reforms of the Westminster?
This is such a boring thing to say, and I'm sorry for it. But
we want to hear it.
It has to start with electoral reform.
Yeah, there you go.
There may be no other room in the country, apart from the Electoral Reform Society, where that statement gets that response. And part of the reason for that, it's not like we can talk about the democracy, and obviously any country where you're not counting 2/3 of the votes is a country that you're not doing the democracy thing properly. That's fine.
You're not representing the people.
Right. But the thing that concerns me much more than that is just big, thumping government majorities. I hate them. And the reason that I hate them is because they're poor for scrutiny. And they're not just poor for scrutiny. So look at what happens. Imagine the incentives. And this is actually the reason that the assisted dying bill was a very bad example of why Westminster fails. I mean, we can have complaints about the process, but actually those are very different complaints to the ones we usually get. Because it's a free vote, none of the usual pernicious elements are applied. So in most other scenarios, what you'll get is you'll just get a government saying, we want to do X. And in the vast majority of advanced democracies, pretty much just excluding like the US and Canada, and most other countries are using electoral reform. And so what happens? You have a much harder time. You have to convince people of your position. You're going to have a session as part of the legislative agenda that is away from plenary, sort of well away from the main hall. It's in committee, and you're going to have people there, and they're going to have to try and negotiate a solution. So you saw something like this in Scotland when they were talking about the hate bill that was passed about 3 or 4 years ago. And this is a humanist example, is why I'm raising it. There were sort of like versions of like, okay, well, fine. Well, we kind of get what you're trying to do here, but we would like protections for atheist bloggers, for instance. Can you do that to satisfy our concerns? That is like constructive adversariality in the legislative process. What do you get in Westminster? None of that. Why do you not get it? Because of the great big thumping government majority. So instead, no matter what someone from the opposition stands up to say, it doesn't make any difference. The government will just say, we can ignore you because we've got a majority, we'll do it anyway. Now that's bad for the government, it means the ideas aren't tested. But what does it mean for the opposition, whoever is in the opposition? It means that they're infantilized. Because they're not listened to, they don't have to bother to come up with any kind of constructive critique. They can just basically stand up and go like, you're a shower of bastards. And they will hope that by virtue of doing that, they'll be clipped on the news, or they'll be clipped on social media, and it will do something else that's good for them. But what it won't have done has improved the legislation in any way, shape, or form. So that electoral problem that we have, we almost always talk about it in terms of democracy. What it also is an extremely malign effect on the level of legislative scrutiny that we get. I'm aware that that's just one thing, but do you really want me to talk for 3 times that long?
No. I do, actually. But I mean, that's an excellent example. I thought you were going to go somewhere different. I thought you were going to talk a bit about whips. One of the things I've noticed in this new parliament, at least with the government, is that the government whip is much more insistent and controlling and stronger, I think, than most other government whips officers I've seen in the last sort of 15 years. Now, of course, there's good reason for that, and they're very disciplined. But let's talk a bit about the whip's office. I thought that was where you were going with one of the comments you made about what reforms you would like to see. Tell us, you cover this in your book, what is the whip's office and what does it do?
It's like an intelligence and enforcement body for the party within Parliament. So one of the very first things that an MP will say once they're in Parliament, will be at least informed by the whip, the maiden speech. And you'll continue to be corralled by these guys. So back in the day, not that long ago, within, say in the noughties, and even in the teens, the whips were quite brutal. And it would be this kind of like massive bollocking and threats of, we know about your affair, and so you better vote this way with the party and blah, blah, blah. It's much more touchy-feely now, and you'll definitely get instances of whips, of MPs, particularly Labour MPs, actually, who, when they've had problems with their own party, would often say, actually, I got support from the whips, and there was someone who's to listen to me there. Nevertheless, they are still what they are supposed to be, which is intelligence, to feed up intelligence about, is there a backbench rebellion, is there possible sort of, angst, are there concerns, anxiety in the parliamentary party, but also to put down enforcement and try and get people to vote the way that the party wants them to be. Now, that's obviously a problem, right? Because our whole idea of what an MP is supposed to be doing, okay, number one, the constituency work. Number two, they're supposed to be scrutinising the legislation. Like, if that is not happening, we've lost the main function of what's supposed to be the democratic process. And if the whips are working properly, that will simply not be happening. And any MP who will be talking to you realistically, in private or in public, will say, the vast majority of time, MPs have no idea what it is that they're voting on. They're just being shoved here, shoved there. It's this amendment. They've got too many demands on their time. Why would they start paying attention? All you do is start destroying your own career. And it would take up so much time that you couldn't do the constituency casework anyway. So instead, you just get these kind of corroded out robots. That's what the system is encouraging, just the complete eradication of independent judgment from a politician. That just doesn't seem like a healthy way to be organising your democratic society, but it is fundamentally the way that we organise ours.
You could make an argument in defence of whipping and in defence of that system that relies on saying that if you're a member of a political party, you have to some extent bought into a community of trust. You trust that party's basic beliefs. You trust their judgment as it applies to particular legislation. You can't, as an MP, like you say, read every clause of every bill every time anything comes forward. And so for matters on which you're not personally an expert, you just sort of contract out your view. And the whip in this view of things would not be an enforcer so much as a kindly, educator. Who could just tell you, well, this is what we think about this. You're a Labour MP, you trust Labour values and Labour judgment, so just go through this lobby. That's also partly what they do.
That's overwhelmingly as well the tone that is used with MPs. And look, I'm not going to pretend that there's a society we can have where political parties cease to exist. People would coalesce around values. I'm innately suspicious of them, and I want them heavily scrutinised and restrained in their influence. I just don't think, there's no point pretending that we can get rid of them, because I don't think we can. So instead, your job is, what can we do to equip MPs to use their individual judgment? And one of the things you can do, for instance, is you could have a set cadre. At the moment, the government basically controls the civil service. That's essentially how that works. There are plenty of other countries, the US is one of them, where you have cadres of officials, of bureaucrats, who will inform politicians about things in legislation, especially in financial legislation. We can do the same thing for our MPs. We can equip them to actually understand the legislation that they're looking at, so they're not just turned into human meat puppets that are thrown into one angle and then thrown into another. So on that basis, it's not so much like, do political parties have a right to exist and to try and exert some influence? Fine. But it's more, what can we do to equip MPs to be better at scrutinising legislation? Which, by the way, will help them. The quality of the legislation that we pass in this country is so unspeakably piss poor. It's the one thing that is kept from public view that no one really wants to admit. Broadly written, so that it infringes on rights all over the place, often very unclear as to what it's trying to achieve or the method it would try and use it, increasingly not really bothering to write legislation at all, but just coming up with skeleton bills, where it's just essentially just lists of ministerial powers through statutory instruments. The ministers can then just go off and do whatever the fuck they want with. We had this previously. By the time we got to COVID, they were using statutory instruments to pass legislation which no one had even read. There were whole days where people were unaware of what the laws were, that they could be potentially put in prison for failing to follow. That is a complete breakdown of your legislative process, and one of the core reasons that we've allowed it to take place is because MPs have been infantilised by the whip system into not properly scrutinising it.
It was a good time to be a lobbyist, though, COVID, because you really only had to convince one person.
I bet you had a great time.
Instead of 656.
I mean, you were alone on Zoom with a huge amount of political influence, but other than that, it would have been good.
Well, I enjoyed it. We might get a good demonstration very soon of independent-mindedness from at least some backbench MPs. We're expecting, I think, a Labour rebellion on benefits reform.
Oh, sure.
Quite soon. Isn't that the ultimate scrutiny and restraint of power? Those sorts of rebellions?
Yeah, I think that's the main thing you've got left. And by the way, that's one of the things that people underestimate about the usefulness of having parties in power that broadly share your values, because it means that the backbenchers will broadly share your values. And that, it's not so much that the backbenchers are going to win, they'll almost never, I mean, especially this kind of majority, they'll never win. But it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to have, even 20, let alone 40, 60 come out. So the thing that people sort of fail to understand about rebellions is really that by the time it's happening on the Commons floor, you've lost. The whole of the system in Westminster is really based on corners. It's based on hushed conversations away from the main spotlight. And that is to do with people like threatening to rebel, then being taken into to a meeting with a junior minister, a senior minister, eventually even the Prime Minister, to say, look, this is how to stop us rebelling. And most of the changes that you can secure to legislation, whether it's on benefits or any other matter, will be in those behind-the-scenes conversations. They're not documented. They barely make it out to journalists a lot of the time. There's certainly no minutes for any of them. There's very little academic work on this kind of area, precisely for this reason. So that's how it works. When that fails, you then take it to a rebellion. And in that case, it's what you usually end up seeing is MPs adopting a sort of their own informal kind of semi-whipping system of trying to make sure everyone stays firm, keeps their back straight. It's really hard to walk into the to walk into the opposite lobby to your colleagues.
Absolutely.
Party people, it's not just their career, it's very often their entire social network. It's very often where they met their partner at the local party. It's where lots of their friends come from. And the kind of vitriol that they will face, they will owe it, the conversations in the book of people who voted against their party, they'll just be like, these are people that weren't my friends. These are people that I had pints with. And then they are just screaming at you, calling you a traitor, using the worst possible invective you can imagine. That takes an extraordinary degree of emotional and moral courage. And on that basis, you need to have pretty strong support systems informally from MPs that allow those rebellions to carry through. And that's the kind of pressures that actually the people thinking of rebelling on this battle will be feeling at the moment.
Another way of having that sort of feeling, of course, is, some extra parliamentary community of which you're a part. I can think of...
Is there one that you're thinking of in particular?
Yes, there is, yeah. You've ruined that for me, but yeah. Yeah, the Catholic Church... That's what I was going to talk about.
No, I haven't.
No, I'm talking about Humanists UK and the all-party parliamentary humanist group in particular, because I've seen that exert a counter pull on people, and they think, these are my friends, but these are also my friends, and you can almost see that as a balance in an MP who does care very much about, let's say, humanist marriage, even though their party is now in government, and they're sort of torn between these. Obviously, their political party is going to, in the end, be the strongest force. But does it worry you, this isn't a question that we've ever talked about, does it worry you that even in that level, the lobbying level, that Westminster politics is so based on tribe and emotion and connection in that sense, rather than reason and scrutiny and policy thinking?
Yeah, of course, yeah. That's kind of the problem. That these are the values that are in it. So on all institutions, you can see the incentives that they create. And those incentives create a culture. Okay? Now we see clearly what the institutions, basically the political parties working within Parliament, what kind of incentives they create towards sort of thoughtlessness and ignorance and conformity and tribalism. And we can see very clearly where we create incentives within Parliament, institutions within Parliament that create different incentives. So look at the Select Committee, right? The Select Committee system. You've just described the way that extra parliamentary groups can create another form of identity for MPs. Select committees really interestingly do the same thing. And what's telling about these institutions, and they are institutions, what kind of values are they based on? Cross-party cooperation, consensus seeking. The whips are not part of what is going on in the Select Committee. That is not how the membership is selected. It's selected by MPs themselves voting on it. They're not part of the conversations that take place behind closed doors. They're based on evidence seeking, on the seeking of specialist skills from experts that appear in front of the Select Committee, but not just that. The specialist people that come in from outside brought in by this, well, they're not really civil servants, but essentially by people working for the House of Commons in order to bring in that expertise. So suddenly these are just completely different values. And then what do we find? We find that statistically, MPs who are more likely to be tempted to join select committees are those who really don't like tribalism, who do seek to work in a cooperative way, and that once they join a select committee, they're more willing to rebel against the party whip. In other words, what have we created? People that care about evidence, people that care about expertise, people that care about independent judgment, about trying to find consensus rather than just the meaningless shouting matches that we see. Again, you see it. That is an institution. It creates incentives. And that gives us an indication of the kind of broader reform that we can implement if we want to have a better kind of politics.
The select committees for you an example of something that works in the
works
Westminster
really well.
system? Yeah. What else works well in the Westminster system?
Oh, you're not going to like this. So the House of Lords works very well.
I knew he was going to say that. I don't know who says this.
And then we need to think about why is it working well? There's something, you don't have to necessarily support it as it is. I mean, I don't support it as it is, to think that we can still learn things about what's happening there. There's two main things about it. The first one is that the government does not control the House of Lords. Okay, so that takes you back to the electoral reform argument. So the government has no control. So as soon as the government can't just force its will through the Lords, what does it have to do? It has to try and convince people of its position. So the debate in the House of Lords is not like the debate in the House of Commons. It is a place that sneers at dogma, that looks down on people, that talk party political platitudes. You have to bring some level of expertise, some level of independent judgment there in order to try and get the things that you want through. It is a place where the government is willing to amend its legislation, often because it's forced to amend its legislation, but often because it just hears, well, actually, frankly, because half the time the government looks at its legislation in the Lords, it's almost like it's the first time it's even fucking read the bill. And this is like, oh my God, well, I guess that is a mess. We better clean that part up. And then what is the second reason that things start to work in the Lords? It's because of the crossbench peers. Crossbench peers are not a majority of the peers in the Lords. They're introduced kind of almost by accident by Tony Blair, in much the same way that Thatcher almost by accident introduced the select committees. The best things in the British political system tend to happen when prime ministers don't realise they're probably happening. And what does it bring you? It brings you people from outside of politics. They're not party loyalists. They're people with a background in science, in business, in law. They're seriously impressive. And they have expertise. It's like basically the one place in the system where you actually see proper expertise. So then they come out to play. And suddenly when they come out to play, they will start tearing up the things that you have done on benefits, on legal changes. We've actually been seeing it recently with AI and copyright, the way the House of Lords has worked there. That is the place where you start to refine and improve legislation. That is a process that simply just does not really meaningfully happen elsewhere. You might see a tiny bit, if you're really lucky, a committee stage of a bill, but not very often, because committee stage is a fucking joke. So really you're going to see it in the House of Lords. Now we can just say, okay, fine, I hate it because it's not democratic. Well, fine. Okay, but nevertheless, people that want to change it need to explain how we're going to be able to keep those functions, because at the moment, one of the only places a bill is properly looked at is in the Lords.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Blair and Brown government, I remember, would often start technical, complicated bills in the Lords. The Equality Act started, the Equality Bill started in the House of Lords and had it all, so that by the time it got to the Commons, it was actually, a good bill rather than a government bill that started in the Commons and had to wait till it got to the Lords.
Can I talk about something else that's good? I don't want to, I don't usually do that, so we might as well.
Let's have some, we want some optimism in our lives.
Okay. There was a bloke called Michael Barber. He's actually kind of sort of half working with Labour at the moment, but not in as meaningful capacity as I would like. But he had a really impressive period in the second Blair term. First Blair term, he kind of wasted it, really. And then the third Blair term, it was just the Brown-Blair thing was just this kind of...
The Human Rights Act was passed in the first Blair term.
Yeah, okay, fine. I mean, it's not that you can't find bits of legislation, but basically it was not great. It was pretty good for education, that's about it. Something really interesting happened in the second Blair term, when we were all talking about Iraq. But the really crucial thing that happened for our quality of life in this country was that they brought in Michael Barber, who was really different. He'd been previously doing education work, and they brought him in with a much wider remit for health, for transport. And he's just had a very different personality type to the usual Westminster person, especially around Downing Street. Downing Street's quite shouty, macho, know-nothing bollocks. So you'll have people walking around and they'll be like, I'll tear off your mother's skin and I'll wear it as a mask to your political funeral and all that just shouty nonsense. And you put that guy to one side and instead you get this, I'm literally quoting you from last night. And so you get this person who's much more kind of gentle, academic, curious. was the crucial element of his personality. He was sort of asking people questions. He would ask the Department for Transport questions, for instance, of like, why have you got such poor performance in autumn? And they're like, well, you know why? Because there's leaves on the line, right? And he was like, well, no, I understand that the leaves fall from trees. What I don't understand is why this suits constantly take you by surprise. And it was like, well, are there actually countries, that have done different jobs on this? Canada had one approach, which is basically, because it's Canada, it was like, just chop down all the trees. You're like, okay, fine, so that's one thing. And then Poland had a different, like applying a particular kind of resin that would help with the braking in case of rain. That was applied, and it got significant improvements. In the NHS, what was applied was the idea of having the 98% rate on being seen within 4 hours in A&E. Why was that picked? Not just because you want a good consumer experience in A&E. You want it because if you can get people from A&E onto the wards, it's because you've been able to get them off the wards into social care. It was a litmus test of institutional health across the health service and into society itself. They were picked in an academic way by him. He was in charge of the delivery unit, which is this really hands-on thing that I think it's quite telling when you look at what's happening with Labour now. His main job, as he saw it, was, I am undistractable. September the 11th has happened. Afghanistan, Iraq, that's all happening, and Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, is going to be off dealing with that stuff. But this unit, the delivery unit, will stay on point with the things that will, A, win us the election, but B, actually improve the country itself. Now, that kind of system, having an actual functioning system in Downing Street that is coordinated with the departments, with the special advisors, with the secretaries of state, with the civil service infrastructure, working to deliverable timetables towards overall goals that show broader institutional health, that is a possible thing to do. And we know that because we had it. Now, on that basis, it is replicable now, and if we have that kind of central intelligence working away, we'd be getting better outcomes than we are at the moment.
Whereas normally, and I think number 10 has slipped back now into normal times, it's actually quite dysfunctional as a unit.
Yeah, I mean, what you're seeing in number 10 at the moment is just the same thing that you always see. It's just the lunacy grind of British politics, where it's like day in, day out, another scandal, another thing to say, we're going to comment on this, we have to shout about that, what are we going to do about this? Prime Minister gets sucked into dealing with that when he's not off to, the interminable series of summits that have to be engaged in. And you just start to go into that Westminster state that journalists have, that ministers have, that civil servants have, that the Prime Minister has, of just the empty calories, the day-to-day churn of political noise, rather than the kind of fundamental structural and operational units that you need in order to secure long-lasting change.
I'm going to come in a moment to questions, but first of all, I want to questions from everyone here. First of all, I want to ask you about another important part of our system. I was going to say constitution, but it's not quite that system, which is another check on government within the Westminster system, which is the press.
Oh,
people like
bastards.
you. I know. Yeah. Well, of course, it's an important part in our unwritten constitution that the press should shine a light and protect. But they're often, it's not happening. I mean, a lot of political journalism, yours exempted from this, is pretty poor.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. I think. Look. So one part of that is pernicious, and the other part is not our fault. The part that's pernicious is the political influence, and that has just always been there. And it's partly to do with what was always the funding model, which is essentially you made most of the money from advertising. That was, it wasn't from the cover price of the newspaper, it was predominantly from advertising. And that meant that newspapers from the very beginning, you look at things like the success of the Mail, usually had a right-wing pitch, either aspirational working and middle class, predominantly middle class, or people who were just already rich, the FT. If you read, the FT's How to Spend It, you realise just how little money you truly have. Okay, so then it took years, a really long time before we could get any kind of working class newspaper. The Mirror, which then was actually set up by the people that owned the Daily Mail. That's why you have this right-wing tilt towards the British press, which informs what's covered on broadcasting. Right. And that continues to this day. Like the scrutiny function of the press is really tilted towards the right and almost always has been. The second thing that happened to us then was just that the internet destroyed our financial model completely. So before the internet, and even for a little bit afterwards, journalists would mostly get about a day to write a story. You'd come in, you'd talk to contacts, you'd attend a press conference, you'd very often get time with a minister or with a junior minister to speak. You'd have some time to think about it. You maybe even have a couple of hours to read a report, and not just the executive summary of a report, but an actual report to put together something that really informs the reader. After the internet, we just got destroyed out there. people weren't paying for the journalism. The display advertising, no one read, so advertisers stopped giving you money as a news website. Worst of all, especially for the local press, the classified advertising died to be replaced by Craigslist, which is actually debilitating for a local journalism financing model. And so they started shedding jobs. And what happened is very quickly, even by the time I came in, a journalist was expected to write about 3 stories a day. So suddenly you've just lost a third of the time, really 2/3 of the time for each story. And then it's like, oh no, and use your social media, and we want you to do a quick clip on the video. Now, I talk to journalists now who have to do 5 stories, 7 stories a day. Well, how good is yours? Like, where is the expertise coming from? Where is the specialist knowledge coming from that you can scrutinize what a minister is doing? Who is there to say, well, actually, the homelessness unit did that 25 years ago?
Yeah, exactly.
No one has that institutional memory anymore because you've lost most of those home affairs editors, you've lost the crime editors,
that's
the
the other
specialist
question I was
journalists.
going to ask, because it also seems to me the content has shifted. When you did, if you think about someone like Polly Toynbee, who started her career as a social affairs and then home affairs and had and then policy editor, and now, I don't know why I picked on her, but she's a good example. She had a long career and she's still sort of writing in that mode. Whereas I think a lot of the content of political journalism seems to have become less about policy and government and more about elections. And, I think it's very odd that at this stage, in the first year of a parliament,
Yes.
90% of the coverage should be about how this will play in that election, how might this play in the election, rather than what's actually happening and the policy content.
Yeah. It's what I could,
Is that because it's easier to cover that when you've got less resources?
I cannot understand that shit. I just can't get it. Because it doesn't seem like, what is the least interesting possible angle on the spending review?
Right.
Which admittedly is not even that interesting a thing, but what's the least interesting version is, how does this play in an election in 4 years' time
Exactly.
for reform? And you're like, what the fuck? How is that the fucking angle?
Yeah.
Nevertheless, that's the angle that they choose to go through. And I think part of that is the failure of the lobby, really, to think in any kind of lateral sense. There's almost no policy appraisal whatsoever, except insofar as it creates a problem within the party.
Right. Then it's interesting. If
then
someone's
it's
going to rebel on this, or someone's not going to like this, or this is to please those
So how
people.
will a policy work? We get almost nothing on that.
Yeah.
Will they lose this vote, this thin layer of now? We get lots of coverage on that. And then also, really usefully, what happened after a policy was introduced? Let's say Michael Gove did a lot of reform to the curriculum when he was Education Secretary, right? How has that gone? Does anyone know? Is there anyone providing any information on that? Even something like universal credit now, something that got a lot more pickup in the build-up and probably had more detail on the policy as it was coming into force. How many people really talk to you now about how that is functioning? It's incredibly rare because the lobby is, by comparison, is the journalists that are working in Parliament, has this real frenzied sense of personality and soap opera and now. Everything is now. There's very little sense of how things go down in the country and also the kind of impact they have on the country in the end. That stuff is really very pernicious, and it's one of our core failings as an industry. I don't have any good news. I used it all up with the Michael Barber shit.
That's okay. Well, your writing is a noble exception to this
Thank you very much.
current lack. I think we all agree about that.
So I just wondered how much because legislation is only the start. When you sign that bill and everybody's congratulating themselves, that is only the start of it. So how much do they consider the realities of how that's going to be implemented? Because I see a lot of laws which are like, oh, this is wonderful, but it's like, actually, this is in an existing law. We just don't have we're not enforcing it. So because there's been massive reductions in like public sector workforce, the regulators' code means that we've got to be not getting in the way of economic growth. Our courts are in a mess.
Yeah.
Prisons are at capacity.
Yeah.
So what I was wondering is how much they actually consider the reality of that, and actually when they're putting out legislation, are they doing like any sort of thinking about that? Because they don't seem to be doing that.
Thank you.
No, I mean, you're not going to be surprised to hear that I don't have very good things to report in that respect. You could use pre-legislative scrutiny for some of that. You can use pilot projects for some of that. I mean, many of these things have gone terribly out of fashion with just this desperate need to pursue legislation very, very fast.
At pace, as they now say, at pace. I don't know what that even means.
No, what's shocking is that Westminster proceeds according to a series of really quite eye-watering time requirements that simply do not need to exist. They act as if all legislation needs to be emergency legislation. So then when you see things like report stage, it's very often just like, we're talking 5 hours if you know the stage of a bill that's supposed to be about the forensic assessment taking place, on the floor of the House of Commons. So I'm afraid, no, that the need for speed, that makes it sound far sexier than it really is, takes precedence over any of the kind of impacts that many of these bills would have. There are counter-examples, but generally as a culture, that's where the emphasis is placed.
I've been to a number of hustings, or 2 or 3 hustings, and one of the features about them is that almost all the questions to the panel of would-be, wannabe MPs are parochial.
Yeah, I bet.
About what are you going to do in our constituency? So we live near Stonehenge. Are you in favour of the Stonehenge tunnel, or aren't you in favour of the Stonehenge tunnel? was mostly about. Very few of the questions, well, none of the questions are about your fitness to be a minister. So there's no questions about whether they've ever had any project management experience, senior management experience, financially, any relevant experience to be a good minister. None at all. So the public are being asked to vote for people on the basis of parochial issues, send them up there, and they don't deal with parochial issues. Many of them will then become ministers, and I suspect many of them are completely inappropriate persons, unqualified persons, to hold that role. I think that's a fundamental flaw in the system.
Don't you agree?
I do. So you're right. There's about 600,000 people in this country who are members of political parties. So, I mean, look, to give you an impression of that, the National Trust has 5 times as many members as all of the political parties combined. It is a minority pursuit, political party membership. The idea that these guys, and by the way, those husting sessions are attended by a tiny minority of the people who are members of political parties. So it's really a minority of a minority who are getting to choose, very often, who will be the MP. Because there's so many safe seats in this country that very often just their decision is just who is going to be the MP. It's not really who's going to be the candidate, it's actually who's going to be the MP. I asked every single politician when I was writing the Westminster book, were you asked any questions about how to scrutinise legislation or scrutinise the government during your hustings or at any point during the selection process? And every single one of them said none of that ever came up. And in fact, most people wouldn't even know if you were to say, do you intend to pray against negative statutory instruments? Well, most people just don't know what the fuck you're talking about. You just sound like you're mad, So
it is mad.
It is basically crazy. So on that basis, no, we don't test for it. And that's the crucial thing. Like, if you imagine any other job, it's the same with people going for a ministerial position. No one would ever dream of asking, what's your experience, in the environment, if you want to be the environment secretary? That would be like a ludicrous question to ask. But if you go for a job in any other part of society, the first question you're going to be asked is, what experience do you have in this area that you wish to actually have some sort of influence over? On that basis, essentially, that is a cultural question. And we're not going to change it. I mean, I have to say, the things that people look for in those hustings debates, very depressing. These are people, and no fair credit, someone has to do this, but these are people who spend their Sundays putting party political leaflets in the rain through letterboxes. And what do they look for in the candidate? People who will put party political leaflets through the door in the rain on Sundays. I mean, that is a problem, because that is not the person that you want scrutinising legislation. We are not testing for the things that we require constitutionally from the role.
I'll take both these two together, just through the happenstance of you sitting next to each other.
Hello.
Hey.
Not to change topic too much, I'd like to ask you a humanist question based on your recent interview on Andrew Copson's podcast.
Oh, no. Who the fuck is Andrew Copson?
Oh, what a bastard. This always happens to me.
You spoke a lot about liberalism in the podcast, and I'd like to know, firstly, do you consider liberalism and humanism largely the same thing? Is there anything a humanist label offers you which the liberal label doesn't? And then why you chose to write how to be a liberal and not how to be a humanist?
All right, yeah. I can't believe I never knew I was in such a dangerous room. It's just going to go fucking Jeremy Paxman on me over here. Okay, right, fine. I mean, I did for the vast majority of conversations, I would consider them broadly interchangeable. You were going to have, I don't know why, let's put it this way. Let's say that we were having a thorny conversation about individual liberty. The rules around smoking in a car, or, let's say like the smoking ban would be one example of that, or maybe ID cards or something like that. I don't know I think it would be quite unlikely in that scenario that you'd use the word humanism to talk about the views that you're dealing with here, even though you may find lots of overlap. similarly, if you're talking, in a more sort of like religious conversation, I think you'd probably be less likely to use the word liberal than you would humanism in that context. So I think most of the time, you're sort of responding to the broader currents of where you are. Look, liberal is the word that I used for my belief system, and that is like a long, long heritage. From some people, by the way, that starts with religion. It starts basically with sort of Protestant extremists. He doesn't believe this, but it does. I'm afraid that's what it does.
That's not actually correct.
It's just literally
true.
What the Lebanons are, but that's sure, yeah,
complete
sure.
ahistorical.
But anyway, no, it does. So honestly, in that story, that's a very specific story and a kind of heritage that I come from. But also, like, at the moment, it is liberalism is the great defense for liberty and reason around the world. And we are in the most dangerous fucking moment certainly since the Second World War, for the attempt to eradicate liberalism and everything that it stands for. And right now, to me, especially in public-facing roles, it's just to talk very clearly with a word that people kind of know what the background is to. Just be like, this is the shit that we're in danger of losing right now, and that every time the barbarians at the gate, in the way that they are right now, we should all be very, very vigilant about what happens next.
It's also a word that's accessible to, as it were, non-humanists. I mean, this is what Karl Popper said. He's like, yes, let's have humanists, and then let's find other concepts where we can be talking humanism, but with another word, so that other people who, don't quite notice, actually.
Will you raise your eyebrows up and down when you do it in those cases as well?
I will. I'm going to raise my eyebrows suggestively. I do that whenever I'm suggesting that sort of thing. Only with Ian, though. Yes.
It's segueing pretty well, actually. So from humanism and liberalism to, let's call it fascism and populism. The media is telling us that Nigel Farage is a major threat. The BBC is telling us, we're getting it all the time. The political parties seem to be saying that he is a major threat to politics because Labour seem to be sort of designing policy around out-Faraging Farage. The Conservatives, even the Green Party, are having a kind of eco-populist that's taking a pop at the leadership there. So how genuine do you think that threat is? And if Reform get more MPs in Parliament, is there a positive from it?
I still think that the fundamentals of the dynamic, the Farage dynamic, are the same as they have always been, which is that the real threat that he poses is not by becoming Prime Minister, which I don't think he is ever going to be. It is by the influence that he has on mainstream politicians. Now, it was on the centre-right. Like, why did Brexit happen? Because of Nigel Farage. But he didn't need to be in a position of power to do that. He just needed, almost laughably to think about it now, to provide a threat on the right flank at a local election years before Brexit took place, for David Cameron to announce that we would have a referendum on the matter. That's how that happened. And the same thing is happening now. It's about influencing the mainstream. Like, I do fundamentally, it is, first past the post punishes smaller parties until you hit a certain level, and then it starts to reward you, very, very heavily indeed. It is possible that Reform would hit that level. I don't think it's very likely. I think the far more likely outcome is that what we see on the right at the moment is what we saw on the left during the Thatcher era, which is just shattering your electoral coalition in half and leaving the other side to just stay in power, even when there's more popular vote on the other side. There's more popular vote against Thatcherism than there was for it, but there was monopolisation of the right-wing vote under one party. That, I think, is what's happening right now. I think Labour can look forward to a long time in power under the scenario that we see. But that doesn't necessarily make things fantastic if you just start emulating all of Reform's policies on the more reactionary, the more lurid, the more colourful forms of sort of like aggressive reactionary political language. So on that basis, no, it's quite a dangerous moment, but I think the danger comes from the mainstream adopting this more radical frame rather than from them taking power altogether.
Well, that's in the national level, though, but Reform administrations now control almost every primary school in the Midlands. Which is another way of looking at it, because they've won all the educational authorities in the entire East and West Midlands.
Yes, no, that's true.
That's already happened. So it's there's that element to consider too. Sorry, I know this is about Westminster, but I just thought I'd throw that in. I live in one of those councils.
Oh, God.
Okay, yeah, Raj, and then at the front here, and then we're going to go back to Miriam. And yeah.
Hi, Ian. I'm Raj. I'm a jaded ex-political activist. So your jadedness kind of fits with my feeling about politics. So the question I was going to ask was about local journalism and a little bit about like buying papers. So I subscribe to the Sheffield Tribune, which is a local paper here that puts out sort of an email with an article in it probably about 2 or 3 times a week. It's fantastic. It's really very different to something like the Sheffield Star, which is your typical local journalism as a result of all the things you've already talked about. There's also Manchester Mill and then Jim Waterson's London Centric, those sort of papers. I guess my question is, as a person who's trying to not have journalism fall apart, do you think that sort of model of much smaller papers doing fewer things but doing them in more depth is one that's sustainable? And is me going out and buying a physical paper, given that a lot of the revenue comes from advertising, actually going to make a difference to the outcomes of your big broadsheet papers or your big tabloids? Yeah, am I making a difference by buying physical papers, which is what I've started doing?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's better than not doing it. I mean, it's not, obviously on its own, it's not going to change everything, but it's better than not doing it. I mean, you also, by the way, in a way that I wish people would pay more attention to, the things you click on have a huge impact. Like I spent 15 years working on the back end of a website, where we would look at what the traffic did. Each click is not just about you wanting to read something. It is a demand for more of that kind of content, or at least I promise you an editorial, that is how we interpret it. Okay, so on that basis, you do want to think, the next time you see something on a Daily Mail sidebar of shame, you better think, do I really want to encourage more of that kind of content? Because you don't have to. I have concerns about, I do think we're in a better place with journalism than we were, even when I published the Westminster book. The last 2 years on having a sort of membership model for a lot of journalistic outlets on Substack. I'm guessing Substack is what they're using for... But right, exactly. That you're ultimately paying for the local journalism. That's put us in a good place. I have a concern. My concern is, I do think there must be a tipping point on subscriptions coming soon, whether it's by newsletter or people generally feeling when it comes to my music, when it comes to having 5 different TV subscriptions, that model feels flimsy at the moment. And I think if it falls, journalism could be badly affected. Because I think it'll be the first thing. I think they'll get rid of the journalism before they get rid of their Amazon Prime subscription, I'm afraid. And I think that's a problem. The second is, the paywalls concern me. We have basically created, almost by accident, this media ecosystem where all of the conspiracy theory, gibberish, baseless nonsense is free and can spread everywhere. But the actual journalism, because it costs much more money, that is actually, checking facts and is reliable, is behind a paywall. And that feels like, that may have been a good thing for keeping journalism alive, but in terms of keeping democracy alive, that feels like a really bad arrangement that we've settled already.
All right, we're going to take this question here and then the 2 at the back.
Do you think we will ever see electoral reform, or are we stuck in a Sisyphean nightmare that it benefit, like the people who could change it benefit too much from how it is?
Stuck.
I'm a bit scared about that at the moment because I feel like we're losing the left on electoral reform.
Definitely.
Because it's so obvious that right now, if you were to have it, it would help reform and get you lots of reform MPs. And I'm sorry, but the reality is that is correct and must be accepted. It just has to be said out loud. There's no point pretending otherwise. And the reason that those MPs would be there is because people are voting for them. There is no good argument for we need to ignore people's votes. I think that's a disaster. But the truth is, you will always have a slice of people who are basically supporting electoral reform because they think it's useful to them. That has been the left for the last 15 years, and now that's sort of not the case and things are shifting. My personal opinion, because I don't think the Tories, no matter how badly smashed they're getting right now, are ever going to switch to electoral reform. So I think the answer is basically going to be, we will get electoral reform if we get lucky enough to have a Labour-Lib Dem coalition.
Exactly.
That is what I want. I like when people go if I'm in a painful dental operation and I have to think of something nice, I imagine Labour-Lib Dem coalitions. And that's what I want. So I think that's what you're kind of looking for. And then my thing is really for people that campaign on this stuff, have your arguments ready for when that takes place. Remember last time on AV, those arguments were not ready. Okay, so we need those arguments ready, and we need to stress test them, not amongst ourselves, but among others. You know where the weaknesses are? Our weaknesses are that it'll be interpreted as a backroom stitch-up when people go into coalition talks. We know what our strengths are, which is every vote should count. How do we neutralize the weaknesses and increase the strengths of our argument? Those are the conversations that should be there in preparation for when things finally fall our way.
We look forward to that day. The AV campaign was the most dispiriting campaign I've ever been part of in my life. You would knock on the door, sort of, have you heard the good news about electoral reform? And people would be like, I don't even know what you're talking about.
Even my partner at the time, I remember we had a leaflet, and she just said, like, she picked it up, and she was like, why is Colin Firth talking about audio-visual equipment? And that's what I knew. I was like, we're doomed.
And that's it, we're finished.
Yeah.
Yes, over here first, okay.
Thank you for the talk. Fascinating and deeply depressing. A lot of the...
That is me. I feel pretty proud about that.
That's his
actually.
profile. That's what he writes on his bio.
Thank you very much.
things.
I'll sit down now. The question is, how much of it do you feel is specific to the UK, and how much is part of global trends that we're seeing in many places?
Very good.
Yeah. So, I mean, loads, obviously on populism, these are trends that we're seeing everywhere. No one is immune. No country is immune. And everyone needs their own defences against it. In terms of the sort of individual problems that we have, loads of them are quite specific to the UK and about the kind of institutions that we've built in this country. And other countries have their own completely different problems. Like I was sat with, because my social life is so exciting, I was talking to a Dutch constitutional expert. And he basically said, we really have a much better political culture than you, because basically our assumptions on our culture are that everyone's going to be a little bit disappointed by an ideal political outcome. That's what you're aiming for in a negotiation, that everyone's a bit pissed off, but not too pissed off. That's so much more mature than our winner-takes-all machismo nonsense. On the other side, he was like, we have a much worse political culture than you because we only have one constituency, and that constituency is the Netherlands, right? And so we don't have any link with a local MP. We don't have anyone that we can go to in that way. We feel like the political class is taking place on this great big sort of solar plane above us, and that encourages alienation and dissatisfaction. And in almost every country, you can find those specific problems to do with their culture, to do with their constitutional arrangement, to do with their political life.
But they've got good local government too. I mean, that's another difference.
They do, but the link they really do care about and feel the absence of.
They want that. Interesting. Okay, last question before we go back to...
Yeah, this has to be fantastic.
So okay.
No pressure, Miriam.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I'm going to do a very brief one. Simple conversation, U-turns. Are they a sign of bad government or a sign that governance is working as well as it could in circumstances? Second one, very, very, very brief.
Oh, come on. What are you doing?
Overstated. Yes, no.
Go on.
No, it's okay. Wait, what was
No, ask the second question. We didn't hear it because it was my fault.
Simple. Lobbying, everybody makes a fuss. Is it overstated?
Lobbying.
Lobbying?
Yes or no?
Yeah. So, no. And then the first question.
No. I don't really know. I mean, I feel like I've just been chucked into a lobby by the whips. Yeah.
Come on, I know all your secrets.
Yeah. What is it? What was the first part? Wait.
U-turn, if you want to.
I mean, it sort of depends on the context, right? I mean, ultimately, you're looking for parties who are capable of thinking for themselves. Most of the time, they're going to make those U-turns.
YouTubes. Unitunes.
All right, fuck it. Yeah. Okay, we're done here.
Take it at your own pace.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much.
Go on.
Look, it really depends on why it's happening. So lots of the time, it's just being done because you're feeling the electoral pressure. There may be a recent example from Labour on, winter fuel payments that will give you an indication of that. At other times, just because a party is actually noticing the things that are happening. And everyone comes at that from that same position. You know that it would have been better if the Conservatives had U-turned on the poll tax earlier than they did. You know that there is obviously something a bit unseemly and empty and vacuous about the way that Labour is currently U-turning on winter fuel payments, because it's not coming from any real assessment of the damage it would do. It's coming from the impact of them on an electoral level. So really what you're looking for is parties that are thinking about the country rather than their electoral prospects, and that's the better question to ask, I think.
And that's what we're all looking for. 5 minutes' time, you'll be back in the Octagon to listen to Professor Harvey Whitehouse about evolution, history, and the future of religion. But before we make our way over there, please do join me. I'm sure you'll agree we're very lucky to have him in the editorial board.